My dad used to go underwater spearfishing a bunch down in Mexico, and as much as I'd like to join him sometime, I think I'll avoid the night dives. According to him, it wasn't strictly legal to hunt fish with lights at night, as the dumb fish just swam towards whatever you shine at them and just kinda stare at it all dumbstruck. It makes for easy fishing, but he said it can be incredibly creepy sometimes, and it turns stuff that'd be cool and interesting in the daytime into stuff of nightmares. You see, you're just kinda suspended in a total void, and aside from the moon, your lights are the only thing to see by. So one minute there's nothing, and the next, you shine your light and boom, scary fish just right there in your face. Like this one time, he was swimming in the darkness and he was vaguely aware of someone swimming next to him. Not exactly unusual since they went down in groups, and at the time, there were several people in the water. But still, he's thinking, why is their light off? Is everything okay? If they were swimming that close, it probably is his dive partner, in which case, it was his responsibility to make sure that they were all good. Before he could shine his light on them to check if they were okay, his dive partner taps his arm from the other side and gives him the A-OK sign, in which case, either whoever was next to him was separated from their dive buddy, or it wasn't a person at all. He's feeling pretty nervous by the time he moves in to shine his light, and when he does, he sees he was right to be nervous, because this huge barracuda is just feet away from him. Some barracudas can grow to be almost 6 to 7 feet long. They're really fast, and they are absolutely ferocious. They're not scared to attack humans either, and they've been known to attack surface snorkelers thinking they're just big wounded sea animals. On top of that, probably the scariest thing about barracudas is the little hook tooth in the center of their jaw. That little doozy enables barracudas to rip out whole chunks of flesh, probably most useful when attacking a larger prey, like a night diver, just like my dad. Obviously, he's filled with anxiety, so he moved back a bit, but the creature just kept near him. He wasn't gunning for barracudas, but my dad is getting ready to defend himself, and he waves his spear gun in this cuda's direction to try and scare it off. It doesn't attack him, it just backs off, but then it carries on maintaining a steady distance while swimming parallel. After a while, it becomes obvious that this barracuda isn't interested in attacking them, so my dad and his diving buddies just carry on with their spearfishing. It didn't take long for the beam of his flashlight to illuminate a fish, so my dad starts slowly swimming over to it while aiming his spear gun in its general direction. Then suddenly, in an explosion of brutal, predatory speed, the barracuda shot out of the darkness and intercepted the fish. My dad said it was lightning fast. Just wham. The cuda's jaws were like laser-guided, clamping around the fish before it retreated back into the inky black waters. Seconds later, it shows back up again like, "Thanks, my guy. Where to next?" This kept up for as long as the dive did. The barracuda stayed close, using my father's light for hunting. Every so often, my dad or his buddies would go get a fish, and sometimes the barracuda even kept his distance, almost like it wanted my dad to get a few himself. And since they're natural pack hunters, that's probably exactly what was happening. When at last the time came to return to the boat, the barracuda remained by his side until they reached the boat, then spun in the darkness and quickly swam away. My dad said they're like the velociraptors of the sea, absolutely terrifying to encounter, very dangerous, but obviously smart as heck to boot. And if it hadn't realized that it could take advantage of my dad's light, it might have decided that it was him on the menu, in which case, I think he'd have been in a boatload of trouble. I do a lot of spearfishing and snorkeling in my spare time. I've always been drawn to the sea and the ocean. I think it's probably the single most beautiful and powerful force on the planet. Like, I get why people are so interested in space, UFOs, or life on other planets. But for me, there's this whole alien world that's easily explorable, and it's right there in front of our noses. But that bizarre alien world isn't just fun and fascinating. Sometimes it can be straight up frightening. And to me, the fact that you're totally out of your depth, both figuratively and literally, makes certain encounters all the scarier. So, this one time I'm in the Atlantic and the tide is pretty rough. I'm about 30 or 40 feet down just exploring all these pocket reefs, but since the waves are so rough and it's churning up the seabed, visibility is down to like 40 feet at most. I'm swimming along, I look up, and right at the edge of my visibility, I see this huge creature swimming above me. It has to be at least 2 or 3 foot thick, and maybe 8 or 9 foot long. I can't see any kind of head or tail, but it just leads me to believe that it's even bigger than I first realized. The thing's skin is like a light silver with somewhat darker golden or brown stripes. It was only there for a second. It must have been turning to go the other direction, and I only saw a part of its body, but I'd never seen anything like that before at any of my usual diving spots. And instead of being intrigued and curious like I'd normally be, I started swimming away out of pure instinct. It was an undeniable feeling of absolute dread and horror. My body was telling me that whatever that thing was, I needed to get out of the water as fast as I could. I stopped swimming towards it and immediately pivoted back to the boat. I swam on my back so I could keep looking behind me in the direction that thing had been. But the worst part was knowing that it didn't matter if I kept an eye on it or not. Because if it was the worst case scenario, and it was a tiger shark, I'd be a dead man if it even thought about hunting me. I grew up in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia, the only daughter of a man who basically lived for fishing. So as you can imagine, we spent heaps of time out in the water or on the beach while my dad waded out into the surface and cast his rod out. On this one occasion, me and my mum, who grew up in Scotland, were walking up and down the beach while Dad focused on his fishing. Suddenly, she reached down into a rock pool and picks up this little cone shell, saying, "Look how pretty this thing is. Look at the colors." I walked over to look at it, just in time to see this tiny little tentacle emerge from a crack in the shell. It wasn't empty. No. The sea snail that calls those things home was just that, still home. And suddenly I realized what it was. In Aussie schools, there isn't a great deal of time dedicated to teaching us all about the thousands of dangerous animals that live here. Honestly, it's definitely something we play up for tourists, so it's not like every Aussie kid is terrified to go outside after a health and safety at the beach class. But we're definitely taught not to go sticking our hands into cracks or crevices, and there's 1 or 2 animals we're explicitly told not to touch. And the Conus textile is one of them. More commonly known as the cloth of gold cone, or just gold cones. They're a kind of carnivorous sea snail that eats other sea snails, only the way it catches them is totally metal. Remember I mentioned that little tentacle thing? Well, it's basically the thing's tongue. It uses it to eat mostly, but at the very tip is what essentially is a single needle-sharp tooth. It jabs this tooth into its prey, injects a bunch of toxins into it, then Bob's your uncle. Dinner is served. It also has a bunch of tiny little fibers at the end of its tongue, and they're basically taste or smell glands that can help find the right kind of prey. Honestly, look up a video of this thing's anatomy. It's literally the stuff of nightmares and makes every creepy alien film look like Mars Attacks, I'm telling you. Only trouble is, this very same toxin is one of the most powerful in the world, and it's actually strong enough to kill a human. So when that little bugger's tentacle came out and started probing for my mom's skin, it was literally about to do her a serious mischief that she might not have survived. There was this moment after I slapped the snail shell out of her hand where she was all angry with me, like, "Gemma, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" I remember her saying. Then, in the time it took to tell her exactly what that bloody thing she was holding was, she went from angry as anything to eternally grateful in mere seconds. Like you'd think she'd know better after living down under for the better part of 20 years, but no. Old Bird still walks around like she's in Leith. Dad always used to laugh, saying we'd come home one day to find her cuddling a brown snake. But that might just be a bridge too far. I used to work on commercial fishing ships out in the Atlantic. like these huge things with like 50 or 60 dudes on the crew. Being in the middle of a storm can be real exciting at times, but some pretty hilarious stuff goes down during rough seas. For example, if you time a jump right as the ship hits a wave, you can basically float in midair for a second or two, and you can almost film yourself defying gravity in your quarters or trick your friend into thinking you can pull off a legit smooth criminal lean because you've been doing ankle yoga. You're an idiot, Ty, but I love you anyways. Anyways, once you've been on a few trips, you don't get too nervous when crazier stuff happens, but the first time you see certain things, it honestly kind of feels like you're about to lose your mind. Take lightning, for example. First time you see it strike the ocean, the kind of light it gives off is almost impossible to compute. It's not quite as light as daytime, but let me tell you, it's close. And then the sea starts to boil in that area. Well, not technically boil, more like frothing in the immediate area the lightning strike occurred. But you want to see something that'll make you start believing in a vengeful and powerful God? Check out a lightning strike on the open ocean in the middle of the night. But even scarier than that is being on the ship's bridge in a trough between two swells. It's bad enough in the daytime, but again, at night it's like 100 times worse, because all you see is these two huge walls of darkness just blotting out the stars on either side of you, until it looks like you're about to be lost to some void forever. The ocean is actually way more terrifying and powerful than I ever could have imagined, and working on those boats taught me to fear and respect it in a way that landlubbers like you just can't comprehend. I grew up in a place called Prestatyn in North Wales, and because of the pier, fishing is quite popular among the residents. My dad and brother were proper anoraks about it when I was a lad, but the idea of standing out in the horrible weather was just unbearable, so only once did they ever manage to convince me to go. In classic beginner's luck fashion, I'm the first to feel a tug on my line, so following their careful instruction, I managed to reel the thing in and get it out of the water. I was feeling really proud of myself, my first fish on my first ever attempt, but right as I'm about to try and grab the thing off my hook, I hear my dad shout, "Don't touch it." It's only when I notice the rather freaky-looking black spines on the thing's back, and as it turns out, they're not just sharp as needles, they're actually poisonous too. You see, I'd hooked what's called a lesser weaver, and they have poisonous spines on their back. We had to get it off the line really quick too, because if they die, they can wash up on the beach with their spines still very capable of delivering their poison. And then get this, not only does the bite hurt, but it can spread up your arm and leg until the entire affected limb is just on fire. Only way to get rid of the poison and stop the whole thing from getting worse is to basically put the wound in boiling water. Well, not exactly boiling, but hot enough to hurt, because it's got to basically cook the proteins that the poison is made of. And after I learned that, I never went fishing again. If Britain is the land of nothing poisonous, as they say, why in God's name would I go looking for poisonous stuff in the sea? Sod that, I'd rather watch a rugby match in a warm pub any day. I've been lucky enough to marry a woman who's just as passionate about fishing as I am, only her thing is catching catfish. She makes the best fried catfish, by the way, while mine is catching bass. If you're expecting a great recipe out of me, there are none. She can't stand the bass trips as they bore the life out of her. I know, she's crazy and she's from Shreveport, and that's like a double whammy. But every so often, she's nice enough to accompany me on the odd trip, especially the overnight kind, because she loves camping and night fishing. So one night I decided to pay her back for being such a darling about the whole thing and take her night fishing for catfish. Sometimes our work schedules made it hard to have any quality time together, and since her birthday was coming up, I figured I'd make it a part of the whole birthday package. Anyways, we're fishing, and we have a nice little campfire going. It's a warm and peaceful night. But out of nowhere, I just start getting this really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I've been an outdoorsman all of my life and don't get freaked out too easily about the woods or the night or anything like that. So I feel off, but I asked the fiancée if she's having a good time and she said that she wasn't getting any bad vibes or anything. So we just get back to trying to relax. Only a few minutes later, I noticed that there was not a single sound to be heard. No owls, no crickets, no nothing. It was dead out there. And that's when I knew that there was some kind of predator in the area, one that could probably very well see us, but there was no way we'd ever be able to see it in time. So I tell my wife it's time to pack up and to do so quickly, but not in a panicked way. She knows the deal, so she just helps me get the RV together. Only just as we're about to drive off, I hear something large step on a branch and made a loud crack. I don't know what it was, but I had seen bear droppings near there a time or two, so it could have been that, a coyote, or it could have just been our minds playing tricks on us. Certainly nothing that I think was supernatural, but those kinds of things would definitely make you feel squishy and vulnerable. Back when I was a teenager, me and my brother were absolutely obsessed with fishing. We still enjoy the occasional trip all these years later, don't get me wrong, but back then we lived and breathed river fishing. So much so that we used to participate in fishing tournaments and therefore had to take part in training sessions every other day. Spoilers, but these training sessions were just an excuse to get some time in by the river, and I won't bore you with how fishing tournaments work. So just take our word that we fished an awful lot. Anyway, I was like 13 years old. It was September, and me and my brother were fishing down at this river bend out in the sticks. Now you gotta keep in mind that in river and lake fishing, you gotta be quiet as a mouse unless you scare the fish away. So as the skies darkened and this low rumble of thunder echoed around the sky, well, you can imagine how creepy that was. Obviously, we're expecting rain, but that doesn't mean we're gonna stop fishing. It'd have to take much more than that to scare us off. And cue the appearance of some creepy stranger who walks out of the woods on the other side of the river. He doesn't have any gear with him besides a rod, but he's got a fishing hat on, one that has all this scraggly gray hair tumbling out from under it. We try to wave hi, but he just gives us this look as if to say, "You're in my spot." And me and my brother are getting ready to pack up if he asks us, because God knows people can get real territorial about their favorite spot being creeped on. But the guy doesn't say anything, and he just walks about 100 yards upstream and starts fishing up there. Alright, he was kind of choking off our spot, but we were never ones to back away from a challenge, so we stayed put. As we're fishing, the thunder and lightning gets louder and louder, and the gaps between them get shorter and shorter, meaning it's slowly traveling right above our heads. I end up looking upstream to see if the grumpy older dude is still there, and he is. But then I notice how his rod is bending, and it doesn't sit right with me. It looked nice and strong, but way too flexible to be anything other than carbon fiber, or at least that was my guess. But here's the thing. Although you don't think of carbon fiber as being metal, it is super conductive to electricity, meaning if this guy really was using a CF rod, it wasn't so much a fishing rod as a lightning rod. I remember whispering to my brother like, "Think that guy's using a carbon fiber?" To which he replies, "Nah, he's old. He's not dumb." "Look at the way the thing's bending though," I remember saying. My brother looks again, and that's when he sees what I'm seeing. And then out of nowhere, this huge crack and flash let us know that we've just been within about 100 yards of a lightning strike that impacted real close to our grumpy fishing guy. We get up and just hightail it over to where he was standing, and there's this guy's rod, lying there in the dirt, smoking. We start looking around for the guy to see if he's okay, but we couldn't find anything. Not a single trace of this dude. But then, my brother finds one of the guy's boots lying near the roots of a tree, and that's smoking too. And that's when he looks up, and we finally find where the guy went. The lightning had blown this poor SOB right up into a tree. We bailed to the nearest gas station to call the EMTs, but by that time, the guy was long dead and there was no saving him. This was a long time ago and a memory that stuck with me for a long time, and it was truly very hard to get back into fishing after that, but out of all the freaky occurrences that kind of came out of that, the one thing that really stuck with me was the smell in the air when we finally found him. It honestly smelled like barbecue pork. About 3 years ago now, me and a few buddies all found ourselves with some time off on the same day. We all work fairly erratic hours, so on a whim, we decided to bomb it down to the Keys with 2 of our kayaks. We'd heard that there were some serious bonefish just outside of Hillsborough Inlet out near Pompano Beach, and for those that don't know, those bad boys can be absolute units. The world record is like 16 pounds, and trust me, that's a lot of fish considering you're only a stone's throw away from the sand. So anyway, we get up before first light, load up the truck, then head off towards Pompano. Then I don't know if there was some kind of accident ahead of us or if we were just unlucky, but the traffic on the way down to the beach was terrible. So right as we're coming up to an exit, we just say, screw it, and decide to head over to the Bonefish Flats so we could make the most of our time off. It was the right call because by the time we rolled up to the flats, the sun had only just started to peak above the horizon. I don't say this about a lot of stuff, but it was actually breathtaking. It had been a while since I'd been fishing that early, and as much as getting up early sucks hard, it's always worth it when the weather clears in South Florida. We're greeted with this falling tide dumping off of the flat, but it was still nice and high, so we'd have at least a few hours of fishing ahead of us. So I climb into one of the kayaks and start paddling out, just kind of enjoying the ebb and flow of the tide for a while. You got to remember it's still like 6 a.m. and I barely had time to grab coffee or breakfast before we headed out, so I swear I could have just dozed back off there and then. It was super relaxing, right up until I started to get this real prickly feeling. I've been out on the water for maybe 15 to 20 minutes at that point, just chilling. And like I said, the whole time I've been as relaxed as could be. Then you know that feeling of unease you get that one feels like you're being watched? I get that really bad. But when I paddle myself around doing a 180, all I see is my buddy on the beach getting each of our rods ready. He owed us from last time, so don't hate on me. It's only then that I catch a glimpse of something moving in the water below me. And when I get a good look, I see it's way bigger than a bonefish. It was like 10 feet long, the size of a freaking fridge, and it's just silently gliding underneath my kayak in about 8 feet of water. It was a bull shark, easily the biggest I'd ever seen, and definitely the closest I'd ever been to one. I start paddling back to shore as fast as I could, like it was almost an involuntary motion. My brain didn't even give me time to figure out if I was really in danger or not. It just went, shark, time to leave, and my body did the rest. By that time, my buddy is out on the water too, and he does the same thing as me. Looks up like, what's going on? Then looks down into the water. Only he lets out a, oh my god, before he starts paddling like he's got an engine attached to his kayak. We'd seen sharks before, but usually way further out and from the safety of a boat. Seeing one that up close was like a shock to the system that I can only barely describe. I've never felt that kind of base, primal fear before, and it's something I never want to feel again. I'm a fisherman in Greece. I'm sorry for my English, but Reddit helps me learn more every day, so I'll tell my story. In a way, it's kind of a ghost story, but with no real ghosts in it. But to me, it's more haunting than any story of evil spirits that throws things around the room or appears in the dark of night, and I hope you understand why very soon. So we're headed out to sea, and it's a very beautiful day. The sun is shining, there's very little wind, the sea is nice and calm. During rough sea, there's a lot of work to do, but when it starts to calm down, there's not as much work to do. So me and a crewmate are leaning over the edge of the boat, smoking cigarettes and talking football. And that's when I see a child's backpack floating on the water, one with a little cartoon character on it. It's not unusual to see such things floating on the sea from time to time, but a minute later, I see a child's shoe floating on top of the water. Then my friend moves to the front of the boat and points off into the distance. More and more bags and backpacks and shoes, all kinds of personal items are floating on the water's surface in a big collection. At first, I think that someone had just dumped a lot of trash into the sea, which starts to make me angry. I'm sure many of you would be angry at seeing that. But then picture yourself seeing the first body floating lifelessly on the water, then the next body, then another, until you see the fourth body is much smaller than the others and you realize you're looking at a child. Apart from a few murmured curse words and crossing ourselves while we pray, we were totally silent as we passed the bodies. Only the sound of the waves lapping against the boat could be heard, and seeing how some of the bodies were bloated and discolored made me feel like I might vomit. You see, this is in the summer of 2015, when a lot of people from Libya were trying to cross the Mediterranean in small dinghy boats. The traffickers who they paid a lot of money to only cared about getting paid, and they didn't care about if the migrants actually landed in Greece or not. They just cared about money. So lots and lots of them were dying when their boats sank and they can't swim. The worst thing, though, it wasn't just one floating graveyard that I encountered. It was 3, and we even saw one dinghy being turned away by a Greek Coast Guard when their boat was already full of water. I never found out what happened to them, but I pray that they're all safe and okay somewhere. I understand it's a complicated politics situation, but innocent children lost their lives, and I see these children with my own eyes. It's easier to forget the faces of my childhood friends than to forget these things. And when children are dying like that, it's hard to understand why we don't help them. But I'm just a simple fisherman. I do my job. I come home. I try not to think too much. But I am a fisherman that has been haunted by ghosts, and not the kind from storybooks. These ones are very real. About 8 years ago now, me and my dad and a few of my cousins were fishing down in southern Maryland one summer. We were out at a particular spot where there are these things called target ships. These are old, decommissioned Navy ships that have been mounted on top of concrete pillars so they can float no matter how much the Navy tests munitions on them. They get shot at by all kinds of vehicles with all kinds of bullets, bombs, and missiles. But anyway, we're all on my dad's Grady White, fishing for croaker and flounder right near these target ships. If they're actually being used for military exercises, you can't even get near them. So, since there was no one out there to wave us away, we're out near the target ships with about 20 other boats in the water. But then, sure enough, about an hour in, some guys from the Coast Guard sail up to us. They're on a big old CG boat with about 15 trainees on board, and the officer in command asks a favor from my dad. He wants to know if he can practice a little inspection drill with a few of his trainees. Being the good guy he is, my dad gives him permission. Then right as they're coming on board, I feel my rod getting all heavy all of a sudden. I call it out, and the Coast Guard officer stops his inspection and says, "Go ahead, son. Reel it up. Let's see what you got." So I reel, and reel. And it's really obvious how heavy whatever I've caught is, so naturally we're all getting mad excited. Then, to all of our absolute horror, I pull the thing from the water, and we all see what it is. An unexploded bomb. It was a cylindrical diamond shape with neon green stabilizers, about 12 to 14 inches long and be 4 inches in diameter at its thickest part. Well, now the officer, the trainee, and the entire boat of Coast Guards have just witnessed what I'd pulled out of the water, and I'm not kidding when I say that I watched the color drain from all of their faces. They went from pink and healthy to skeletal white in the time it took to say, "uh-oh." The trainee on our boat literally leaps to his boat, and they all haul it away with their sirens on. This leaves a very rattled Coast Guard officer on our boat, who promptly orders me to not move a single muscle. The Coast Guard gets on our VHF and tells all the boats in the area to leave the target ships, and I'm telling you, you ain't never seen fishing boats move so fast. After about 20 minutes of me sitting there with this bomb on my line, the area is finally cleared away. The officer orders my father to put his boat in drive, achieve a good bit of speed, and then don't stop. So my dad does as he's ordered, puts the boat in gear, and in seconds, we're rolling about 15 to 20 knots away from the ship. The officer brings out a knife, cuts my line, and orders my dad to just throttle the boat and get away as fast as he can. Needless to say, it did not detonate when it hit the bottom of the bay. We took the officer, who was pretty clearly shaken, back to his ship. I know it's hard to believe this story without proof, but in this situation, we didn't have time to get a picture of it. We tried, but the Coast Guard officer was adamant about us getting out of there as quick as possible. But take my word for it, it's easily the scariest thing I'd ever had happen to me during a fishing trip. Way back when I was a kid, I used to kill time fishing on a small lake not far from my parents' house. One day, I was alone on a rowboat in the middle of the lake, which is about a mile or two long, by no more than 200 yards at its widest. I was mostly just enjoying the nice weather when I dropped a lure into the water expecting nothing, almost as an afterthought, because I was mostly out there just to get away from my 7 younger siblings, and having always been something of an introvert, my lake escapes became an increasingly common occurrence as the years went on. Then out of nowhere, something huge grabs hold of my bait and pulls my line hard enough to send my little rowboat about 180 degrees into the water. I'm holding on for dear life, praying I'm not about to be pulled overboard by whatever monster fish had a hold of my line. Me and my rowboat then get dragged about 10 feet across the water before crack, my line snaps. Prior to this, my friend who lived on the lake had told a few other friends and me that one morning, waiting for the school bus, he saw a huge living thing in the lake. He described it as being the size of a car and brown. He refused to swim in that lake from then on. The thing is, he wore mild prescription glasses, so of course we teased him mercilessly about being blind, that he thought he saw a freaking lake monster. But my God, whatever took my lure that day was big, real big, and I never had anything happen like that on the lake before or since. I like to think that it was just a huge carp, but sometimes I wonder if it wasn't something else that snapped my line that day. This is back when I was about 15, but me and my family used to go over to Spain every Sunday to a place called Mallorca. My dad was always huge into fishing, but I absolutely hated it. It's the most boring thing ever. But we reached something of a compromise. If I went fishing with him, I could snorkel around the rock pools and stuff while he cracked on with his fishing. That meant hours and hours of uninterrupted snorkeling, and apart from getting occasionally sunburned shoulders, that arrangement suited me just fine. Anyway, so on this one particular occasion, I'm snorkeling around this little lagoon type thing, which had all these cave-like rocks at the bottom. I say cave-like because they weren't exactly big tunnels or anything, just concave surfaces from where the tide worn them away over the years. But still, there's enough room for me to have a little explore before coming back to the surface for more air. Then at one point, I go back down to explore a new one when I see this weird shape. I get a little bit closer only to see the distinct shape of a human body, just floating against the roof of the rock. Hard to describe, but there we were. I let out this pure bubble scream, then proper myself back to the surface, screaming, "Dad! Dead body! Dad!" as loud as I could. It takes me a minute to collect myself, and I'm glad I was in the sea because I swear I actually wet myself. But as soon as I clearly tell him what I saw, He puts his rod down, then throws on a pair of goggles, and then jumps into the water to see what I'm on about. We swim all the way back down, and the closer we get, the more scared I am because I realize I really don't want to be seeing the state this poor person is in. If they'd been floating down there in the little mini cave, they could have been there for weeks, months even, in which case they'd been in a horrifying state of decomposition. But with my dad being the hero, he sees it, gets a bit closer, and suddenly reaches for it and grabs it. Then he starts pulling it out of the cave, and I'm just like, nope, 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 and just fly back up to the surface. I'm thinking I can make myself useful by calling in emergency services or at least grabbing someone who can speak Spanish to the police for us or whatever. But really, I just don't want to have to look at that body. And right as I'm trying not to look, my dad resurfaces and I just hear, "You absolute bloody pillock-Harry." Then he actually starts laughing. I turn around and my dad has what we'll call a naughty adult doll in his grip, one that's totally deflated, and I guess I'd mistaken an adult doll for a freaking dead body. I'm not even joking. It was one of the scariest moments of my entire childhood, and I ended up looking like a right nunce over it. Dad thought it was an absolute riot, and he insisted on taking it back to the villa to show my mom. She thought it was disgusting, but my sister laughed her head off and kept reminding me of the whole thing for the rest of the summer. Then about a week after we got home, I woke up and it was in my bed with me. I let out this proper girl scream, immediately hearing my dad peeing himself laughing in the hall outside. Sometimes I think he was the least mature one in the house, but he still managed to put food on the table and pay all the bills. So despite Mom saying he had the sense of humor of a 12-year-old, he was one of the finest men I ever knew. Rest in peace, Dad. We miss you every day. So about 10 years ago now, I was just some rich kid spending summers on my friend's dad's boat out near Catalina. Then during the summer before college, we're just out cruising when this huge freak wave hit the boat. Everyone except me and this random girl I didn't know were drowned, including a bunch of my really close childhood friends and their parents. The whole incident completely ruined my life. I was a total wreck, and I don't mind admitting that now, but at the time, there was all this denial and anger. I basically stagnated for years, became really antisocial, took up fishing, and it was only a weird encounter while on a fishing trip that actually brought me out of a depression that I honestly think might have killed me if it wasn't for the aforementioned encounter. So I was up in the Pacific Northwest, out on my own, just killing time. I'm doing some lake fishing, and then out of nowhere, this dude appears out of the woods behind me. I'm a little nervous at first, as the guy seems overly friendly, and since I was in the absolute middle of nowhere, meeting some jumpy-looking older man in dirty hiking gear is just too like the start of some low-budget horror movie. He turns out to be kind of harmless, but he was definitely getting on my nerves, asking me why I was out there on my own, asking me if I'd been catching much. I didn't want to be rude or anything, so I kept giving him one-word answers, but then he suddenly says something like, "You're in a lot of pain, huh?" The question kind of caught me off guard, and I remember turning to look at him, trying to think of some smart answer, then not being able to think of one. Then before I could say anything at all, he started telling me how I reminded him of a younger version of himself. I'm about ready to start rolling my eyes when he says, "I lost some of my closest friends in a fishing accident when I was a teenager. Freak wave out on the Atlantic in the middle of the night knocked a bunch of them overboard. Left me in a real bad way for a long time." I didn't say a word in response. I just pretended to do something with my line so I wouldn't actually have to engage him and show how hard his words had affected me. "You want to know the thing that got me through it?" He asked me, and I think that was the only point in the conversation I actually talked back in a way that prompted him to carry on talking. "Mushrooms. Magic mushrooms. Just brew those things up and it'll help you rationalize all kinds of bad stuff." Now, that really did prompt an eye roll. The drugs and alcohol had only ever made me feel worse in the long run, so the idea of going back to them after like a year clean was just out of the question. I know. I sound like some dumb hippie," he laughed. but I promise you, it fixed me. It'll fix you too, because whatever it is that's eating you, son, you need to bury it before it buries you. That last line hit me hard, and as I was struggling to hold it together, he just thanks me for the conversation and apologizes if he seemed intrusive. Then he just wanders off back into the woods. For the longest time, I told myself he was just some crazy old man, and what that little encounter was just some random run-in and didn't really mean anything. But something about the way he spoke really stuck with me, especially how much we related on how he lost his friends, obviously, and especially the part about mushrooms. And that's pretty much what started me on the road of trying mushrooms like 6 months later in an Olympia hotel room. And you know what? He was exactly right. It helped me realize that I didn't have to feel guilty for surviving, and how those that were lost wouldn't hurt me to live my life like a perpetual funeral march. I had to move on. I had to get over it. I wasn't picked to survive. It was all just a horrible accident with no rhyme or reason to it. It's no one's fault. No one was to blame, and especially not me. But I had another weird kind of revelation during that trip. Not necessarily the most terrifying one, but one that still kind of freaks me out even today. I think that guy's life and my life were like echoes of each other. I know that doesn't quite make sense, but put it this way. I don't think that little fishing encounter was random at all. I think me and that random guy are actually in some ways the same person. He's just got a few years head start on me. And I wonder that in the years that follow, I'll find myself walking through some woods somewhere and I'll come across another version of me, someone who's suffering just like I was. And I know it'll be my job to help them, just as the older version of myself helped me. The single most horrifying moment of my life was working on a sport boat in the Gulf of Mexico. This was way back when I used to get work here and there as a hired deckhand, which didn't pay very well, but it allowed me to spend much more time in the water than I would otherwise. Anyway, the guy who owned the boat ended up pulling this giant thresher shark on board, easy to recognize because their tails are huge. Don't ask me how he managed it, but there's this giant freakout. The thing is thrashing around on deck, and there's basically nothing we can do about it. We just have to wait around for it to die before we can toss it overboard. A real shame, I know, but there really was nothing we could do for it. You don't exactly go giving an apex predator CPR unless you're not a fan of your face. So I'm not kidding. About an hour goes by while we're making sure this thing is dead, then we head back out onto deck to try to push it overboard. Once we're pretty sure it's safe, we all start relaxing, taking pictures of the thing and discussing how we're going to get under the thing without hurting ourselves in the process. See, sharks have super rough skin. I mean, it kind of feels like leathery sandpaper in a way, so without the proper protective gear, we could have done some pretty serious damage just trying to get rid of it. Then right as we're gearing up, this one guy stood near the dead shark's head when the dead shark suddenly rears up and just locks its jaws around the dude's calf. I hadn't heard anyone scream like that since my little brother broke his leg. Only in this guy's scream, there was pure terror in it too. The shark started thrashing around, and all of a sudden, I watched blood start gushing onto the deck as the shark tore off a piece of this dude's leg. How it wasn't dead, I have no idea. And maybe it was just its death throes or whatever you want to call it, and it wasn't truly alive. But it sure had enough in its tank to turn that dude's leg into chum. Huge props to the Coast Guard guys who got a fast boat out to us in like record time, and if it wasn't for the tourniquet we got above his knee, I think he would have bled to death right there on the deck. Turns out, sharks don't die for quite a while if you take them out of water. Sometimes they just wait. After that, I was always way stricter when it came to any kind of shark, and during blacktip season, we worked out a clear process that was always the same. Gaff them, then brain them with a Louisville Slugger until they aren't fighting anymore. After that, you gut them and clear out the urine glands. The meat becomes inedible unless you get rid of those pee glands, then tie them off with rope, and continue bleeding out in the water for an hour or two. The real scary thing was seeing them trying to swim away for like an hour or two just on pure reflexes alone. Sharks have been here for 130 million years for a reason, dude. They are truly the apex predators. During the summer of 1986, I was working on a fish packer for BC Packers. It was usually just myself and my skipper, and there's supposed to be a crew of 3 on the small packers. So although it was harder work than it should have been, I was collecting 2 guys' paychecks at the end of the month. Anyways, right at the beginning of the summer, we motored up the Inside Passage past a place called Butedale. Butedale used to be a cannery town of about 10,000 people, but industry there collapsed in the 70s, so by the time we were there, it had been mostly abandoned for at least a decade. Even in the middle of the day, the run-down post-apocalyptic feel made the whole place look incredibly creepy. Like, I wish I'd taken a photo at some point because it was legitimately one of the most eerie-looking places I've ever laid eyes on. Butedale is also only accessible via boat or flat plane, which probably contributed to its decline, but it also gave the place this weird, cut-off from the world, backwards aesthetic to it. I don't really know how to put it into words, but there you go. Fast forward to the end of summer, and we're headed back down the passage. Only this time it's about 3 a.m., and I realize my boss is headed right towards Butedale in the dark. Obviously, I'm a little nervous about this, but I don't want to let him know that I'm scared of nothing more than some old abandoned canning town. So I just keep my mouth shut and prepare to tie up. Now, we could have just dropped anchor and kept away from the town, but when I suggested this, he looked at me like I was crazy and said, "No, we're tying up. What are you scared of, an old abandoned town?" I tell him no, a straight-up lie, but I'm still real nervous as I go out on deck to grab the bowline. Skipper has the floodlight fixed on the dilapidated dock we were to tie up to, and I got the creepiest vibe just looking at it on the approach. Once we tied up, I headed straight for my hole and locked my hatch, the first time I'd ever done so while out on a trip. Not only that, but I grabbed my galley knife and put it under my pillow, just in case anything actually happened during the night. A couple of hours later at daybreak, I untie the boat. All is well, nothing went awry. As the boat is slowly motoring away from the dock, I'm in the stern fetching some eggs and bacon out of a couple of coolers we had tied back there when something caught my attention, and I looked up to see 2 figures standing about 30 feet away, looking out from the ruins of one of Butedale's abandoned buildings. Now, this is where people call nonsense on this story, but I swear to God, they both look like cavemen. I'm talking long hair, barely any clothes on. I mean, their skin looked gray, like they were either real dirty or real malnourished. Either way, the way they just stood there and watched us scared me something fierce, and they basically let us know that whoever they weren't friendly. We pushed out from Butedale as quickly as we could, and you can bet your bottom my boss never had us tied up there again.